Can we save this abandoned mountain bike from the trash and then sell it for a profit as part of my challenge to flip my way from £100 to an e-bike that I plan to give away to my dad at the end of this series? Our cash pot is currently sitting at £522, and after a disastrous loss in the last episode, it's critical that we save this bike and make some cash. So follow along as I show you the process of restoring and selling this Carrera Vengeance. Okay, so this is the next bike in the series, the Carrera Vengeance 27.5. And I actually took this bike on as a part exchange for the last bike that I sold. And you might be thinking, are you absolutely mad? You can already see from the state of it, it's completely trashed. However, these bikes are incredibly popular in the UK. I'll flash up on screen some basic specs and how much they sell for in the UK. But these are generally people's first ever bike. They use them for commuting to work, commuting to school. They spend a lot of their life with very little maintenance, usually being kept outside. And so there are loads of them on Facebook Marketplace going for as little as £30 in this sort of condition. Okay, so let's do a quick condition report on the bike, and we'll start out with the cosmetic condition. So as you can see, even behind some of the dirt and the grime here, the frame is pretty badly scratched up in multiple different areas. And so I think while some of this will just buff out and polish out, some of them are deeper scratches. Either we can leave it and then just mention it in the listing, or we can try and touch it up and make it look a little bit better and also mention it in the listing. It's always nice when a buyer is surprised at how good a bike looks in person over what they thought it was going to look like from the listing. I think that's always a nice way to have it rather than the other way around. Okay, so moving on to the mechanical condition. As you can see here, it's glaringly obvious, isn't it? This drivetrain is completely totaled. The derailleur has snapped off. As you can see, it's got caught in the spokes, and that's then wrapped it around and around and completely snapped it off the hanger. As you can see there, the actual hanger itself has snapped. So it's going to need a brand new derailleur hanger and also a brand new derailleur, because I don't think this is going to be salvageable. I think the actual cage here has bent. Maybe in another video I might try and restore this, but in all honesty, it's a very cheap part to replace, and so therefore it's probably worth just throwing this straight in the bin. Now moving on to the rest of the drivetrain, so I don't actually know what the condition and function of the front derailleur is, but I think looking at it, it seems to be okay. Might just need a little bit of a clean up here. I'll apply the same thinking to the chain rings, so I'll clean them up and see how they perform, and if they're no good, then again they might need to be replaced. Just from a very basic look, they don't look too badly worn, so I think we'll just see how they go. However, the chain and the cassette are quite rusty, and so while I could possibly try and bring these back, I think I've learnt my lesson with the last bike that actually you're better off if you're going to replace the chain, you might as well just go ahead and replace the cassette if it's not going to be too expensive. Now this bike has got mechanical disc brake. The condition, despite being a little bit rusty, is okay. There's a fair amount of life left on both pads, and there's no lip on the disc either. So again, I think we'll just clean these up and see how they get on. As you can see, the cables have gone pretty rusty, and so I think this bike is going to need a full set of new cables. With the rear brake, you might be able to hear it, but it's certainly quite hard to activate the rear brakes. It's quite a long length of cable to get to here. Generally speaking, the bike feels very loose, if that makes sense. So when you pick it up, you can feel stuff moving that probably shouldn't be moving. So that goes for like the wheel bearings. Both of them feel quite rattly, so I think both hubs are going to need a bearing service and then retightening as well. Now the headset feels okay, but we're going to drop this fork out and we'll take a look, and if we need to replace the bearings, we'll do that. The pedals are spinning pretty smoothly and there doesn't feel like there's any play on them. However, when you grab the crank, you can feel that there is a fair amount of play in the bottom bracket, and so that will need to be replaced as well. You can see there the grips are both completely worn out and they're starting to perish. The saddle has also got a hole in it, so both of those will also need to be replaced. As you can see, the forks are in a right state. What happens to these SR Sontor forks is they're left outside and then they'll just rust all the way through. Now I don't know if these forks are seized, but I really hope that they're not. Now I'm under no illusion that this is going to be a very big project. A lot needs to be done on this bike, and that means a lot of money needs to be spent on it. However, I am going to try and do it on the smallest budget possible, and I think I'm going to set that at around £50. Right, so I've gone outside and given the bike a very quick wash before I start disassembling it. And you might think that's a pretty, useless thing to do if I'm going to take it apart and then clean all the components individually anyway. And it's more of a psychological thing because the bike is already starting to look a little bit better. And yes, it's still the same pile of garbage that it was 5 minutes ago, but it's just some sort of positive action. To be completely honest, I've been staring at this bike for like the last week or so, thinking, oh God, the amount of stuff that I've got to do on it. And I do this as a hobby and for fun, so quite frankly, I like to try and enjoy it. And I think that's quite a good rule. If you don't feel like working on your bike, sometimes the best thing to do is literally just give it a wash, and you might feel more incentivized and more motivated to actually get to work on it. So now the chain's off, let's get the rear derailleur off. And I think that goes for the rest of life as well. You know, if you're not feeling very good about something, sometimes the best thing to do is just have a shower, get clean, and then have another go. So I'm just going to undo this bolt here, which is pretty much holding the whole thing together. There we go. Bolts out, and then I can remove the cage and the jockey wheel. Hopefully that then allows us to, oh, there we go, get this unravelled. So you can see it's actually snapped at the hanger, which is kind of what you want with these. You want it to snap at the hanger. As you can see there, it's completely bent, the B-tension screw, when it's been spun around. A lot of people are always asking how long these bike flips take, and I do always try and include an estimate at the end of the video. But it is only an estimate because when I'm filming these videos, it takes about 3 times as long as how long it would take me to just do it if I was going at my own pace. But it does vary massively from bike to bike because, of course, it only takes this bolt here to strip or another bolt to round off. And then, you know, you've added a good half an hour onto the build. If it all goes smoothly, you can generally strip a bike in about half an hour to an hour. The cleaning and the servicing is the most time-consuming part. The build probably takes an hour or so. Then you've got to think about the time to list it and take the photos and write the listing. Just wondering about if I want to remove these pedals. Their bearings feel okay. Of course, now's the time to get them off, especially if they're seized on. It's much easier to get them off the bike while the cranks are still on the bottom bracket, as opposed to trying to yank them off when it's just the pedal attached to the crank. There we go, they're not completely seized. Another fairly time-consuming aspect of bike flipping is the time spent messaging people back on the selling app. You'll get an awful lot of time wasters, even on the most basic bikes, and they'll ask questions that could have been answered if they were to just read the description, but I know some people get a little bit arsey about people asking questions that they could have just found out themselves, but there's no point in being rude to people because ultimately that person could lead into a sale. Then of course you've got the part of actually meeting people up and exchanging the bike and exchanging the money. That can be the most rewarding, but also the most nerve-wracking part of the whole bike flipping experience, because not everybody is nice out there, and you know, I don't let that dissuade me from doing it, but you certainly got to keep your wits about you. So both crank arms have been pretty stubborn on these square tapers, and I don't fancy ruining my crank pull at all. So I'm just going to leave that for a little while and then just move on to getting the handlebars, fork and headset out. So many of the grips you see don't have bar end plugs installed. Probably don't Google the sort of injuries that you can get from that going into your leg after you crash into a tree. These grips have been a little bit stubborn to get off. Get a little bit of solvent under there, and that easily slides off them. Right, so based on how rusty this top cap bolt is, how rusty do we think the steerer tube and headset is going to be? Pretty rusty in there. I'm pretty surprised that I didn't strip the head of this bolt off actually. It was in there really tight and absolutely no grease at all, completely dry. Without going on a bit of a rant about it, I know manufacturers, you've got to save on costs where possible, and that 98% of their customers won't appreciate in the moment the fact that bolts have been greased and stuff like that. But ultimately it saves so many headaches down the line. These spacer rings feel like they could be a bit seized on there, which is not ideal. Right, I think I'll just try the old hammer method. You can actually see the water that's been stuck in there, and I don't think that's the penetrating fluid that I've just put in either. See what these are like as well. Get a rag in there, have a look. See, although you have got that wear line there, It doesn't feel like there's been any pitting or galling or anything like that in there. So luckily the headset race is, I think, good to go. These cranks were quite rusty and stuck on, but with some penetrating fluid and a fair amount of force on the crank pullers, they did eventually come right off. So I bought one of these bottom bracket tools recently because I ended up snapping another one. And for this, I've got one of these long wrenches from Aldi actually. I've named him Long Larry, and he's actually also extendable, so he becomes very long Larry if we need that. Fucking hell. Well, I can tell you now, without that extended leverage, there's no chance I'd have got that loose with the tool that I was using before. There we go. Now, unfortunately, it's a really strange size bottom bracket. I'll put the size on the screen, but luckily, it looks like someone did have the foresight to actually put some grease on this before they put it in. So none of the threads look to be damaged, but get the other side off and then clean the threads up along with the rest of the frame. Okay, that is the bike stripped down pretty much as far as I need to go at this stage. As you can see, I've laid all the components out down here. We've got a pile that's going to go in the bin, and then we've got a pile to be cleaned up. We've also got the wheels that need to be cleaned and serviced, and then the fork that needs to be cleaned up with a minor service done to that as well. So I think I'm going to call that a day today and come back tomorrow and start servicing these components ready for it to be rebuilt. See a lot of people in the comments expressing their distaste for these SR Sontor forks, but for me at least, I do quite like them. Yeah, you know, they're not the absolute best in terms of performance for mountain biking. They don't give you very good damping. They're not that adjustable. They're heavy as well. But if you're just going to be using the bike to get from A to B, these are great forks. Require very little maintenance. The only problem is people just don't treat them very well. They'll leave the bike out in the rain, water will get in, the grease will go all manky and emulsified. In my experience, it hasn't too badly affected the actual use of the fork. They might get a little bit squeaky. They're really easy to service. You literally just clean them up, replace any seals if they're worn out, re-grease it, and then just put it all back together. You don't need any specialist tools, although it's good to get one of these just so you can take the little top caps out. But I actually 3D printed this. But the reason I'm actually disassembling this is so that I can get to the stanchions underneath, because as you can see here, they've gone a bit rusty. But luckily you can take these off and with a little bit of elbow grease get this back to a decent finish. The fact that this has been left outside means that there's probably going to be a decent amount of water come out of this. I'm just going to get a bucket to put underneath. Usually this water absolutely stinks as well. I'm glad I put the bucket under. Oh, goodness me. Look at the sludge in that. There's more water in that than you'd have oil in a proper air suspension fork. Wow. Bit of WD-40 and a bit of steel wool. Bit of patience, not too much pressure. You just glide it over the surface and it just picks up the rust. And I'll keep on going until it's smooth. And as you can see, that's already looking a lot better. It's not perfect. I'll probably go over it another couple of times. Just try and remove a little bit more of this discoloration because it's still a little bit raised. But overall, I'd say that's already looking quite a bit better than before. Great, so I'll do that a few more times, do it on the other side, clean all this horrible mess up down here and get it all reassembled with some fresh grease. Yeah, I'm going to bottle this up and then get that down to the tip because I really don't fancy that going down my drains. Okay, so this is already looking a lot better. Give it a final clean up. So with this polishing compound, it kind of gets all the little fine scratches out and gives it a fairly dull effect. And then when you put the protectant spray on top of that, it brings the shine back out again. It makes it look quite new. And then all the person has to do from then on is just keep applying protectant spray, keep it clean. Cool, I think that's ready to go back on the bike. Okay, so I know I mentioned there was some bearing wobble when I was first inspecting the bike, but I feel it now, there's no play coming from the bearing. But it was actually coming from the spindle, and I hadn't seen a nut like this before, and I just presumed they just put some random nut that they had lying around on. But when I took it off, I'm sure I recognised this part of the nut. It is a spindle end nut, but it's just without the black plastic piece that you normally have on, which might have been okay in that orientation, but unfortunately they put it in the other orientation and it wasn't getting a good grip on the dropouts on the fork, and so it was causing it to wobble around. So I'm just going to replace that with the proper spindle end nut, and hopefully that solves the wobble. However, I've just tested the bearing. Although there's no wobble, I'll show you now. So I don't know if you can hear that, but it sounds pretty rough. So what we'll do, we'll take it apart, get all the bearings out, give them a good clean up, and then re-grease it, and then we'll reassemble this axle. Next, I wanted to clean up the components that I was going to be reusing. As you can see here, most of them are really filthy and rusty from being sat outside in the elements. Again, just using some detergent, brushes and a microfiber cloth, I was able to clean up this caliper and get it looking presentable. I applied the same process on this front derailleur. It also had some rust to remove, but it ended up looking a lot nicer after a bit of a clean. After that, I was left with a pile of clean components ready for me to reuse on the bike. Then moving on to the frame, starting with the bottom bracket threads. So I used a microfiber cloth and some WD-40 to remove all of the old grease so that I can line it with brand new grease when installing the new bottom bracket. For the lighter scratches, I used a small amount of cutting compound which got rid of most of them, and I also touched up some of the larger scratches. As you can see, this does make quite a big visual difference. It's not perfect, but good enough for this second-hand bike. Okay, so that's all the parts cleaned up, serviced and ready to go back on the bikes. Right, so starting by reassembling the headset with a decent amount of fresh, thick grease. It was already feeling quite good beforehand, but this just got that nasty rust and the thin grease out of there and should hopefully make this headset last a little bit longer. Now this bottom bracket had a slightly strange size and I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to find one. But luckily Halfords have come in, saved the day with their bottom bracket. It was pretty cheap as well. The new bottom bracket went in nice and easily. I didn't show it here, but I then added in the non-drive side and torqued it all up to spec. And as you can see now, it's spinning nice and freely. So I got the hanger installed with the new rear derailleur, so hopefully the shifting should be nice and accurate. Unlike a lot of the second-hand bikes that I see where they've been bent from being thrown on the floor and stuff like that. I managed to get a good deal on a new cassette. The old one didn't look too badly worn, but I thought I better not risk it after the last time, and this one looks way better as well. After that I torqued it up to spec using my torque wrench. So I've got a new chain, supposedly it's from Shimano, although it was quite cheap, so I was a bit unsure whether it was genuine Shimano or not. Either way, it does the job. I'll be showing my testing of the bike a little later in the video. Right, so I bought a new saddle for this bike because the other one was ripped. Now, there was a deal on, essentially there's a bunch of colours that you can go for with this saddle, but there was a deal on where if you choose a random colour, you get 50p off. And I thought, well, we're trying to save some money on this build, so let's see what colour they've sent us for this build. Great. That is probably the worst colour they could have sent us, but luckily I've got some green zip ties, so we can maybe go with a black and fluorescent green colour combo. Not my personal preference, I think next time we'll pay the extra 50p. And then just finishing off the build with some brand new cables. So now it's time for the before and after. This time I'm taking you along for the test ride to make sure it's all working well. Okay, so I've just took the bike out for a couple of kilometres to test ride it, Not everything was perfect when I came out. I knew I was going to have to do a little bit of tuning when I was out here, but when I first started the ride, the brakes were both pretty weak on the front and the back. So as per usual with these mechanical discs, you've got to do a little bit of adjustment. So adjusted the cable, adjusted where the fixed pad is sitting, and now they're both feeling excellent. Anyway, I'm able to lock up the front and the rear tyres with someone of my weight. I think that's probably sufficient enough. The gears are performing as expected, probably just need a slight bit of tuning up when I get home. But as many people said in the last episode, you know, you should really be flooring it in every single gear just to make sure there's no problems, no chain slipping at all. And to be fair, it has felt a lot more solid this time around when I've changed the chain and the cassette. So apart from that, just got a few finishing touches like putting the new saddle on, getting the gears tuned up a little bit, and then I think we're ready to take some photos and get it listed for sale. Finally, I used some finishing and protectant spray on the bike, which really brings the dual parts up to a nice shine, as you can see here. And I've found on my personal bikes that it makes it slightly easier to wash in future. So here is my final verdict. Okay, so another bike complete. I'd say overall, I'm pretty happy with how this build turned out. We've certainly taken it from a bike that was probably on its way to the scrap heap or just being completely abandoned to something that has now got a real lease of life and should be usable for another couple of years if the next owner keeps up with the maintenance. That said, there are a couple of things that I would have really liked to have done on this bike had I have had more time and budget. For example, the dust seals on the forks here are starting to get a bit worn out, and so it would have been nice to have replaced those, but the lead time on getting them for just a single pair was quite long. I think the ones that I'd found were going to have to come from China, and so there was about a 3-week wait before I could actually get them. Well, I did try and restore the windows for the shifters. Unfortunately, the plastic has just yellowed. Now, I'm not sure if there's a chemical process that you could use to restore these, but quite simply, it would have been nice to replace these with some brand new glass and just get this whole area looking a little bit newer. The same goes for things like the front and rear tyre. It would have been nice to have a brand new set on there because, again, it just makes the bike look a lot newer. That also applies to the grips. Again, I've got some part-worn ones on here. They look a lot better than the ones that were on it originally, and obviously safer because they've got bar ends on as well. Since we replaced the chain and the cassette, it would have also been nice to replace the chain rings, and whilst there is life left in these, unfortunately you can't replace the individual chain rings. The whole crankset is riveted together, and so if you want to replace the chain rings, you've got to replace the whole crankset, and that is not economically viable for what we're trying to achieve here with this bike. And of course, if I was to do all those things, the bike would be sold in a very different price bracket, and it would probably take a long time to sell as well. Right, so the only thing left to do now is to take some nice high quality photos of the bike, write an honest and accurate description, and get it listed up for sale. And then I'll be back with you in the next section of the video when the bike is sold to discuss how much I've spent on the bike and how much, if any, profit has been made. Okay, so the bike has sold, but before I talk about how much I was able to sell it for, let's talk about what we spent on it. So I was actually able to get some pretty good deals on this project. I tend to buy from bike shops that have got a back-end eBay store. That way I can get some pretty good deals on components. So starting out with the chain, paid just £4.85 for that chain. The saddle was £3.99. The derailleur hanger was £3.98. The rear derailleur itself was £12.89. The bottom bracket, now I tend to spend about £15 for these square taper bottom brackets. So I was pleased to find that Halfords had the exact one that I needed for just £10 delivered. The cassette was £9.29. So with the cables, I had 4 to replace, and 3 of them came from other kits that I had leftover parts for. So they've already been accounted for cost-wise for other bikes previously in this challenge. The only cable that I didn't have was the rear brake cable. I only had front ones that were too short, so I had to buy a longer rear brake cable. I managed to get that from my local hardware shop for just £2. Now, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, I don't count things in this challenge like my operating expenses like solvents, fuel, tax, that sort of thing. I'll leave that all till the very end of this challenge when I'm going to talk about how financially viable bike flipping actually is. So in total, things that I actually spent money on for this particular project, it came to £49.14. Now, if you remember, the budget for this episode was £50. So that came on pretty much bang on budget, which I'm quite pleased about. So we started out the episode with a cash pot of £522 plus the bike in its terrible condition. We then spent £49.14 on the bike, leaving us with the bike in a done-up condition and a cash pot of £473 £2.06. Now, typically with these bikes, they'll go for a maximum price secondhand of about £200, but that's in really good condition. However, this bike was not in perfect condition, and there were quite a few part-worn parts that I'd put on there. So in light of that, I listed the bike for £150 just to see what sort of interest I got. Now, I wasn't expecting to get much interest because we're right at the very end of summer now, going into autumn, and typically sales will really start to drop off around this time of year. However, I did receive a lot of messages about this bike, so I clearly had priced it just about right. Now, I listed it on the Friday night, and I could have probably sold it on the Saturday morning, but I was really busy on Saturday, and so I wasn't checking my phone at all. And when I checked it later on in the day, I'd received loads of messages on the bike, with about 9 or 10 people genuinely interested in purchasing the bike. However, there was one person that was very keen. They messaged me on the Saturday evening, and then they followed up again on the Sunday morning saying that they wanted to come and have a look at the bike that morning. Anyway, they got to test ride the bike around and they were really happy with it. And we ended up on a price of £140, which I actually think is quite good. I think we both got a pretty good deal there. So with that £140, it brings our total cash pot up to £613.06. To be honest, I was pretty disheartened with the result of the last episode making our first loss. However, I do feel like this has certainly turned it around this episode. In fact, if we assume that the last episode was just a complete write-off and we rolled that loss into this particular episode, assuming that the loss that was made was the cost of the bike up front, that means effectively we made a profit of around £70. However, I did have to spend about 10 hours on this bike, so if you work out the hourly rate, I'm sure it's not too good. But I'm not doing this challenge to try and get the maximum hourly rate every time. I'm doing this as a bit of fun and as a challenge, and I'm certainly learning a lot along the way. And I really got you to thank for that, because all the people supporting this series in the comments below, professionals spending their time to leave really helpful tips in the comments, essentially learning from the best. So thank you ever so much for that. So I'm really excited for the next episode. Now, if you want to watch the next episode, click the series playlist here. And if you're all caught up with the episodes, but you want to be notified when the next one comes out, make sure to click the subscribe button here. Anyway, thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much.